Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to our June meeting of the Michigan Peace Council in Detroit area. It's Monday, June 6th. We have monthly meetings on the first Mondays, and we have a discussion at the beginning of the meeting for an hour with special guests. Sometimes they're people, special friends from our own group. Sometimes we have them from outside. And today we have two guests. I'm very excited to have them both here. They're both Puerto Rican, and we're going to discuss Puerto Rico and imperialism. And one guest is Ozzie. We call him Ozzie because many people in this area know Ozzie real well as a musician, band leader, activist. And Osvaldo on his screen there, but we call him Ozzie. Our second guest, we're very excited also to have with us, I met through U.S. Peace Council Board of Directors. She's on the board with some other very prominent people that I'm excited to be part of. It's quite an organization, and her name is Monisha Ríos, and she lives in Puerto Rico right now. So we're going to have them each say hi, and then we're going to have Ozzie speak first. So actually, let's have Monisha say hi for a minute, and then we're going to let Ozzie speak. So hi, Monisha. Welcome to our small little group of Michigan Peace Council activists.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be with you all and get to know you better.
Great.
Tell
And
you more about myself when it's my turn.
okay, we'll learn more about her in a short while. They each have around 10 to 15 minutes. They're going to address our questions in this particular discussion is going to be about Puerto Rico. And I've asked Ozzie if he could handle the sort of like the history and the background so we can learn more about the background leading up to where we're at in Puerto Rico right now. And of course, Monisha lives there now and been very active with what's going on now. So that's going to probably be the dividing point here. And there'll be a crossovers too. So Ozzie, the floor is yours, and we're thrilled to have you with us. Let's talk.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you for the opportunity to present before local friends, and also I'm really happy to be part of a presentation with Monisha, who's more active on the ground at this point than I am. I was asked to kind of present a historical context. And to try to do it in this short period of time, obviously there's going to be some difficulties doing that. We're talking about a country that's, for all practical purposes, has never been independent. It was one of the last colonies, along with Cuba, of Spain. And then we had the Spanish-American War with the United States coming in and basically taking over the island. And since then, the island's been under control of Puerto Rico. In control of Puerto Rico. But I thought I want to talk about some themes that some folks may not be thinking about when they think about Puerto Rico. There tends to be this divide and think about the Puerto Rican nation, when the fact that more Puerto Ricans live outside of the island than actually live on the island. And obviously that has a direct tie to the fact that in 1898, the U.S. kicked the Spain's butt in the Spanish-American War, which, if you know a little bit about history, people will say was instigated by the U.S. And there was a reason why it was instigated by the U.S., because even before the end of slavery, the Southern folks really had an eye on Puerto Rico, but even more so Cuba, for the sugar industry, the plantation system. And I recommend a book by Paul Ortiz called An African American and Latinx History of the United States, which kind of reframes American history, taking into account that there's been this long interaction between Latinos and African Americans. And that, so some of the forces were set in motion even pre-Civil War for the eye on Cuba and Puerto Rico. And the book talks more about Cuba, but if you look at the joint history of Puerto Rico and Cuba, for many, many years, their future there was really determined between the struggle between Spain and the United States. You have to put Puerto Rico in the context of Latin America. It's the only Latin American country that is not independent at this point. So, and that's kind of important to really sit back and think about it, yet also know that the majority of the Puerto Ricans don't live on the island. They live outside of the island. And even if you look at the population on the island, I've read estimates that up to a half, if not more, of the people that live on the island have lived in the United States at one point or another. And so there's this real direct metropolitan colonial relationship. When you think of other Caribbean islands like Martinique, there's this Martinican influence in France. You know, think of Franz Fanon, right? The great revolutionary fighter and wrote Black Skin, White Mass, Wretched of the Earth. So think of it in that sense in terms of Puerto Rico. What happened, we can talk about the fact that Spain conquered Puerto Rico after decimating the native population, not extinguishing it, because Puerto Ricans, a significant number of them, still have Native American heritage. Some recent DNA studies of the population show that of all the Caribbean islands, Puerto Ricans have the highest percentage of people with significant Native American heritage. But a lot of those folks that survived went into the mountains. Puerto Rico's 3/4 mountain. And poor whites even ran into the mountains, and as did the escaped slaves. So that became the formation of the Puerto Rican nation, this blend of the three races. Doesn't mean racism doesn't exist. Colorism is what I call it. But that this blending of the three peoples that we now know as Puerto Ricans really came out of that subjugation of the Spanish. But I think for our conversation, I will concentrate more on what happened after 1898. In 1917, the US passed the Jones Act, which effectively, overnight, literally made all Puerto Ricans US citizens. And if you didn't want the citizenship, I don't know all the details. I can't go back and forth in terms of the legal maneuverings, but you really had to go through a complicated process to deny or to say, I don't want to be a US citizen. And then that left you with the dilemma, a citizen of what? No longer Spanish. Puerto Rico's not an independent state. So that really kind of was a turning point for the dilemma of the Puerto Rican population, both on the island and in the United States. From that very beginning in 1917, 1918, US went into World War I. Right away, Puerto Ricans were recruited in all Puerto Rican units or in African-American units. The most notable one was the Harlem Hellfighters. They were noted also when the Harlem Hellfighters, when they went to Europe as introducing jazz under Jim Reese Europe's band to Europe. And you know, if you know jazz history, France became a real important part of jazz history in Europe, and a lot of African Americans went there to ply their trades in response to segregation. But a lot of people don't know that some of the most notable Puerto Ricans musicians also went to France as part of the Harlem Renaissance troupe, the Harlem, not Renaissance, but Harlem Hellfighters. Out of the Jim Reese Europe band, which was about 35 to 40, 18 of them were recruited directly from the island by Jim Reese, including the great Rafael Hernandez and many other folks who later on became stalwarts in the jazz arena, like Juan Tizot, who went on with Duke Ellington. Reason I bring this up is we're going to talk about Puerto Rico, but let's understand the impact that enslavement, that colonization had on American history. And it's a noticeable kind of influence on African-American history. Soon after, Puerto Rico, there was always a Puerto Rican population in New York with some revolutionaries there like Jesus Colon, who was a very, very prominent bilingual writer for many leftist organizations and newspapers in the United States, most notably the US Communist Party. Arturo Schomburg, who set up the world-renowned Schomburg Institute of Black Research, is the premier African-based study research center in the whole world. That was Arturo Schomburg, Puerto Rican. I mentioned the Harlem Renaissance. A lot of Puerto Ricans and Cubans, but more Puerto Ricans were involved in the Harlem Renaissance. And so that the impact of imperialism on the island had a direct impact on the African-American movement here in the United States. Clearly, Puerto Ricans set up their own community in New York, and then after World War II, Puerto Ricans came en masse and settled in New York primarily. Operation Bootstrap right after World War II led to hundreds of thousands of people every single year leaving the island. And so that really started cascading the migration out of the island towards the metropolitan area of the United States. In fact, there's an old saying when I used to grow up, ¿Tú eres de aquí or de allá? Are you from here or de afuera? Afuera meant, are you from the metropolitan area? So that's become part of the psychic of the Puerto Rican nation, whether you're on the island or not. And why is that important? Because it had its impact on the African-American movement in the United States, particularly some of the Garveyites were Puerto Rican. If you know Marcus Garvey, who was Jamaican, but also from Costa Rica. People don't realize he was also Latin and English-speaking Caribbean. And some of the key leaders were Dominicans and Puerto Ricans in his movement. And I mentioned Jesus Colon. Now, I want to go back to the island in the sense that in the 20s and the 30s, you had the growth of the independence movement. You always had independence organizations on the island, and there was always struggle and even some minor uprisings. But most notable was the Nationalist Party under the leadership of Pedro Albizu Campos, who studied at Harvard, was the valedictorian of his class when he graduated, but was denied that because he was a Black Puerto Rican. One of his teachers actually didn't let him complete his class, so he couldn't become the valedictorian of the Harvard Law School. He was offered a Supreme Court position, the United States, being a Black Puerto Rican in the early 1920s, but decided to go back to Puerto Rico and fight for independence there. And his experience with racism in the United States flavored his understanding of what the metropolitan society had to offer the island. And it was under his leadership that the independence movement, the nationalist movement, became one of open rebellion. There were skirmishes, actual massacres, most notably 1937 Ponce Massacre, where 19 were killed, and 200 people were murdered. Injured, 19 were killed. And it was the day that they held that demonstration where the police attacked them. It was really an event that was celebrating the end of slavery on the island of Puerto Rico. So there was a direct connection between an anti-slavery movement, because Puerto Rico and Cuba did not end slavery till the mid to late 1880s. Even El Grito de Alares, September 23rd, 1868, which is the only time that there was a real significant uprising against the Spanish, was led by Ramon Emeterio Betances, who was also an abolitionist. And what's real interesting is that for a short time, he and other Caribbean island leaders were actually contemplating the building of an Antillean Federation, a United Nation that would have included Haiti, Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. It didn't gain much steam, but you could see that there was this idea of nationalism, but in an internationalist concept. So, for example, a lot of times Ramon Emeterio Betances spent his time in the Dominican Republic and Haiti in his struggle for against the Spanish. Those countries were actually free. moving forward, I think, because this could take a lot of time, I want to just talk about some of the things like Noam Chomsky said Puerto Rico was turned into a plantation society. So that by the 1930s, 40% of arable land was converted into sugarcane plantations. My own father started cutting sugarcane at age 14. So you really had the displacement of the Jibaro class, which is really the peasantry of the island. You really don't have a peasantry on the island because it was destroyed by the sugarcane plantations. So that's kind of an important thing. So during the 30s and 40s, Pedro Albizu Campos led the Nationalist Party, and it was a back and forth struggle. For the most part, until, let me get the year right, 1948, the governors of the island were all American generals or American appointed. The first Puerto Rican governor, he was appointed, but it wasn't until 1948. So clearly in my father's generation, just a few years before I was born. And
Ozzie, we got a couple minutes.
Okay, yeah. And so just before that, when he got in, he instituted the gag law, which made it illegal to display the flag, to talk about independence. So repression came very hard on the island. In 1950, there was an uprising in different cities. Hajuja was the most significant uprising, failed, but a lot of folks went to prison for that. 1950, there was an attempted assassination of Truman a couple days after that uprising. Failed, obviously, but it forced Truman to put the first of a number of plebiscites before the country. And in terms of giving supposedly non-binding plebiscites where people voted whether they wanted to be independent, free, associated state or whatever. And probably the most important event was the 1954 attack on Congress, which included Lolita Brón and 3 of her comrades who shot up the Congress. A lot of people don't know she has family in Detroit. So after Carter commuted the sentences for the 4 of them, and they were the longest held political prisoners in this hemisphere until that point, she came to Detroit and stayed with some of her family members before going on to Chicago. So at this point, I just kind of want to just see, I went over a lot of things and it's kind of hard to cover Puerto Rican independence history, but I wanted to at least make a context that it's not just about the island, but its impact on US civil rights and progressive movements.
Ozzie, thank you so much. History of Puerto Rico in 15 minutes yesterday.
Hey,
Okay, I want to say that before we move to Monisha, what group were you with? The Red Berets? Was that the name of the group?
Oh, Young Lords.
The Young Lords you were with, yes, Young Lords.
Yeah, towards the 10. I mean, I was associated with them from the beginning, but I was a high school student, so not a branch member. I helped to move when they had 2 branches in Puerto Rico. When they decided to close the 2 of them, half of the membership moved to Detroit, and I helped set them up here in Detroit. That was in the early 70s.
All right, thanks so much, Ozzie, for those comments and information. Historically important for us to understand this story we're talking about today. Ozzie, I also mentioned, is an educator. Worked at universities here for a long time too, and probably still does. I don't know. He's always working. So thank you, Ozzie. We're going to move on now to a special guest that came all the way from Puerto Rico to be with us today, and we welcome you so much. Monisha Ríos is going to tell us about herself. She's got a little slide that's going to give her background and continue on. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. All right. So, like Ozzie tried to pack a lot of information into a short period of time for you all, and I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to move quickly so that we can get to the discussion period. And I do need to leave for another event at 8:05. So that's why I'm just going to be like a train. Okay, so share screen. And I'm going to share screen a lot. All right, so this is a little introduction to me. All right, I'm Dr. Monisha Rios. I am Puerto Rican, specifically from the island, so my family comes from the island of Vieques, Puerto Rico. And I'm a psychologist, a social worker, an anti-imperialist veteran of the US Army. For the last 10 years, my work has centered around investigating the military psychological industrial complex, specifically around the narratives that are used against us, against Latin Americans. And I've been working to expose that and working with the US-based peace movement to try and get some traction there. All right, so as I said, I am Viequense, and that has a meaning. So these slides are from a presentation that I've given for Veterans for Peace. I was once on the national board of Veterans for Peace. And so just to situate you geographically, this is where Puerto Rico is in the world on a map. So you can see over here why we have been so coveted by all of the empires from before the US empire formed to now. So our strategic location, we have strategic value for trade domination in the region and military security for that trade. So this is the closer view. Now, oftentimes Puerto Rico is referred to as an island, but Puerto Rico is actually islands. We are an archipelago, and over here you can see Culebra and Vieques, which are also part of Puerto Rico. This is our mainland, not the United States, just to be clear. So this presentation is from an educational series I did about our struggles, our current struggles in Vieques and Culebra. So I'm going to spotlight these two islands, which are hardly ever talked about. And also I'm Viequense, so I'm partial. So quickly moving through this history, Culebra, which is right here, this was the first to be militarized by the United States, beginning in 1901. And Culebra was actually the first to expel the Navy in 1975. Here are some historic photos from that time. And then Vieques. Vieques began to be militarized in 1941 and successfully expelled the Navy in 2003. Vieques was used, as well as Culebra, were used as practice ranges. So from 1941, every single all but real war exercise, starting with Operation Puerto in the 50s, every single war that the US has waged in the world was practiced on Vieques. Every single weapon that the US used was practiced on Vieques, practiced on my family members. And the repercussions of that are with us still today, which I'll get to. This is just some quotes and images from the expropriations. This shows how the land expropriations went. Sorry, I'm trying to skip through the history. Okay, so this is important. This is what we still live with right here. These types of weapons that were used. These are photos from the resistance from both islands. This shows how the health impacts of US military presence and war games in our islands are recognized for veterans, but not for the community. So this is what brings us to our current struggle today. These are open detonations over here of the unexploded ordnance, which there is no way of knowing exactly how many and what types of weapons were used that still live in our waters, that still pollute our land, that still are released into the air, the types of chemicals and everything else. This is what some of the underwater ordnance looks like. We've had to fight for an enclosed detonation chamber for a while. And unfortunately, not all of the ordnance can fit into the enclosed detonation chamber, which would prevent the chemicals and things from going back into the air. This is an example of one of the the thirds of the island of Vieques that were expropriated. This was the practice bombing range. The red is the area that we still cannot access because of all of the leftover ordnance. The yellow areas we can now use, but there are still threats that we will encounter unexploded ordnance. So this is what tourists see. In 2017, after Hurricanes Maria and Irma, the hospital in Vieques was completely destroyed. And since then, we have not had a hospital, and we have had many people die, including children. When I rematriated in January 2020, it was like there were 1 or 2 funerals a week. So this is some of the protests over here with the blocks demanding a hospital. We also suffer with intentionally sabotaged maritime transportation. So if you recall the map in your mind, the way that the water is our highway, and that's what we need to access healthcare because there's no hospital in Vieques. So over here, these are protests. I'm part of a collective, Somos Más que 100 por 35, which means we're more than 100 by 35, which is the measurement of the landmass of the big island of Puerto Rico. Because we're constantly forgotten, we call ourselves the colony of the colony, and Culebra as well, because the Puerto Rican government and the majority of Puerto Ricans who live on the main island don't consider us part of Puerto Rico most of the time, unless it's convenient. Okay, so this was a music video that I used. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute and go to a different slide, because talking about the context of US imperialism and US policy toward Puerto Rico, we cannot move forward without talking about promesa, la ley promesa. So during the Obama era, let me just get to the thing that I want. Okay. Now I'm going to share screen again. Thanks for your patience with me. Okay, what can you see? There we go. All right, now, in 2016, under Obama, with after a couple of years of lobbying from the Puerto Rican Statehood Party, as well as the Puerto Rican ruling class, Obama decided that the illegal debt, the supposed debt that was incurred by corrupt government after corrupt government in Puerto Rico should be paid by the people of Puerto Rico. And in order to resolve this debt, which is illegal to begin with, he established a dictatorial, colonial financial oversight and management board, which we call La Junta. And since then, this board has basically been the authority over the country of Puerto Rico. So this mythology around Puerto Rico existing as a off the list of colonized states of the UN, there's the falsehood is that we are not actually self-governing. There's the appearance of self-governance because we have a puppet government, but the person or people behind the strings, once again, is the United States. And the new form, instead of a military dictatorship, we now have a financial dictatorship. So how much time do I have left, Bill?
Well, let's see, it was 7:32. You got another 10 minutes.
Okay, great, perfect. So now this is where I really want to tie us in to the rest of the world and how US imperialism works in relationship to Puerto Rico. So just as Ozzie was talking about, right now, the majority of Puerto Ricans live outside of Puerto Rico. And you also have Puerto Ricans being the highest number of Spanish-speaking peoples enlisted in the US military. Throughout history, since 1917, right, we have been drafted and economically drafted and colonially drafted, which is how I got in, ever since then. And so we have the largest presence in the US military, which means we have the largest level of activity in US imperialism via the US military activity. So not only are we victims of US imperialism via our colonial status, we have been transformed and weaponized as perpetrators of US imperialism as well. So when you look at, I'm going to stop sharing screen for a sec. So when you look at the US empire's activity in the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean, you need to look at that is also happening in Puerto Rico. Instead of regime change operations in Puerto Rico, you have regime maintenance operations in Puerto Rico. And what that means is via the dictatorial financial control board, as well as the puppet governments that we have had and that people continue to vote in because they think democracy exists here. Our capacity to struggle for and win our independence and our sovereignty is consistently undermined in many of the same ways that the undermining happens in Venezuela, the attempts to undermine in Cuba, and so on and so forth. It's all the same tactics. It's all the same standard operating procedure. It's all the same playbook. So now I'm going to show you exactly how our independence movement has been destabilized recently. Since La Ley Promesa, you can view that as a financial coup. The timing of this coincided a little bit with the coup in Ukraine. I want to ask if any of you are familiar with the name Natalie Jaresko besides Ozzie. No, okay. So now we're gonna go to class here. All right. So Natalie Jaresko is Ukrainian. She's a Ukrainian citizen who the US put into power in Ukraine. Let me find my slideshow for that. I apologize for the delay. Looking for, here we go. All right. Now, I'm assuming you're familiar with the coup in Ukraine in 2014. And what that led to was the establishment of a US approved government. This is Natalie Jaresko. Why Natalie Jaresko is as important as the country's generals. She was there as the Minister of Finance. She's one of 3 foreign-born cabinet ministers to join that US approved government. This goes into, I went into the details of how finance capital basically paves the way for fascism and led to the situation in Ukraine that we're seeing happen today. So the reason why that she's so important for you to think about when you think about Puerto Rico is that all of the devastation that she in her role implemented through financial reforms, through austerity measures, and so on and so forth, she's doing in Puerto Rico. She has done. She's no longer in the seat that she held on the fiscal control board. But there she is. So once she finished doing her dirty work in Ukraine, she was immediately moved to Puerto Rico, where she implemented the same tactics and strategies to privatize, to steal our land, to basically destroy the lives of working Puerto Ricans, to further implement the forced removals of our people off of our lands, to pave the way for crypto colonizers to come in, sorry, I'm getting a little bit heated. But what we have happening now is the same thing that the workers in Ukraine were going through, where all of our essential services have been privatized, which is why we have all the blackouts that we have. And so you have the same tactics and strategies of our previous governments who intentionally did not invest in our infrastructure so that it would fail, so that the narrative around that would lead the people to approve the privatization of essential services like our electrical grid, like our maritime transportation system, like healthcare, like our universities. So now we have, let me unshare. Now what we have are, as a result of Natalie Jaresco's work of US imperialism via finance capital in the colonial context in Puerto Rico, we have more people leaving Puerto Rico. We have the majority of our public schools, our elementary schools, our middle schools, our high schools closing. We have still tarps on roofs because people have not been given the funds that they need to recover from the hurricanes. We still don't have a hospital in Vieques. We have Luma, a private entity that was created. It's a Canadian and US businesses, newly created business who's now taken over our electrical grid, where we still have constant blackouts. People's homes have burnt down because of them. What else? Oh, and recently we had a public sector worker strike, a general strike. So in 2019, it was the summer of Puerto Rico, where people saw how Puerto Ricans took to the streets to oust Ricky Rosselló, who was the statehood party governor at the time. But that was not it was revolutionary to an extent, because what that was more of a color revolution than a revolutionary revolution, because all they did was replace him with Pedro Pierluisi. And I'm sorry, I think I got his first name wrong, but I don't even care because he's a scumbag. But we still have the statehood party in control. He was the lawyer for the Fiscal Control Board, and he was one of the people who went to Congress to lobby for a fiscal control board. So now he's here living high on the hog, acting like Marie Antoinette, saying, let them eat cake, while Puerto Ricans are starving, Puerto Ricans are fleeing, Puerto Ricans don't have electricity, we don't have schools, we don't have proper salaries for our teachers and our public sector workers. The Fiscal Control Board has decided to basically cancel the retirement of people in order to pay off the so-called public debt that bondholders and rich Puerto Ricans and the Puerto Rican government incurred. So there's a lot happening, and our people are doing their absolute best to organize themselves against this, while the deck is really stacked against us, because we also have the labor aristocracy that's hurting us. And what that looks like is, unfortunately, because of the way imperialism works and because of the way it pits workers against each other, when our electrical workers went on strike because they refused to work for this private company because they did not want to see the privatization of our electrical grid, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Chapter 222, sent their union workers to work here. They scabbed our union. So,
You have 1 minute there, Monisha.
okay, thanks. Sorry about that, everybody. There's just a lot.
No, we could go on a long time. I'd love to hear it more, so if you could just conclude it.
Yeah. And then there's just so many details to try to keep track of. But I do have resources to share with you all to encourage you all to kind of start learning more and more about what is happening here and different ways that y'all can help us, because we need solidarity from the states especially. We need y'all to back us up.
Okay, well, I hate to do this to you, Monisha. I mean, this is a big subject, and we're going to have to get with you again and do the full story. You covered a lot of territory in the short time you had, both you and Ozzie. This is not a full-blown webinar at the beginning here. This is like an introduction to our regular monthly meeting, so that we can be inspired by issues that we should know more about. And you certainly both have made it clear that we have to know more about what's going on there. A lot of relevant points you made. Thank you so much. I'm going to open it up, but first I want to ask one question to you both, and then we'll open it up to any other comments. And Monisha has to leave in about 15 minutes, so let's ask questions to her if you want anything special to her, and Ozzie can hang on a little longer than that, I hope. My question is simply, what is our relationship? What is the U.S. relationship now to Puerto Rico? What were the options? What do people have a choice of? Independence, statehood, what other options?
Free associated state, the current status.
That's what it is. Free associated, free?
Well, that's the terminology, but that's been since the early 1950s. So it's a nebulous, it's a neither here nor there situation.
What does the U.S. call the relationship? A colony?
No, they don't want to call it a colony. It actually went before the United Nations some years back, but that's the way to get around calling it a colony, free associated state, which meant Puerto Ricans, for example, I can vote in the U.S. elections here, but not if I actually moved to the island, I couldn't vote for the president. So we're U.S. citizens, but we don't have direct rights if you're on the island.
What about you, Monisha?
So you can look at freely associated state. That terminology is the same thing as, or similar to, a compact of free association, like the Marshall Islands has,
Yeah.
where they have pseudo sovereignty. Supposedly they're self-governing, but basically the US and the US military dominate. So in our case, what the freely associated state means, and that question you asked, the US does not call us a colony, but they call us an unincorporated territory. And what that means, literally in law, is that we are part of the United States, but not of the United States. We are belonging to the United States, but we are not the United States. So we are, what is it, foreign in a domestic sense, is what they say.
So what do the progressives ask for?
The progressives.
On the island, what are the progressives asking for? Independence, statehood?
So the people who are decolonial and anti-imperialist want independence, not sovereignty. So sovereignty and independence in our context do not mean the same thing. There are the sovereigntists who want a compact of free association, who want to maintain the type of relationship with the United States that the Marshall Islands have. And then there are people like myself who are independentistas, and we want complete, absolute, complete freedom, where we could maintain a type of relationship on our own terms with the United States, but our foreign policy and our economy are not tied to the United States in any kind of way that is paternalistic or
So
whatever else.
you'd be a nation state, in other words, a nation state.
Yes.
That's what you prefer. Okay, that's clarified. Thank you so much. Now we're going to open up to the guests who are here for any questions or comments. Please sort of raise your hand like this, or put your hand up with the icon, so we make sure that you get a chance to address any concerns you have. This is a great presentation that raised a lot of questions. Would anybody like to speak? No one has any questions, it looks like. That's very interesting. Okay, well, Sharon does. Okay, Sharon. Let's give Sharon.
I appreciate both of your talks. I learned a lot. And in the 60s, I was working in New York, and I worked in a health clinic where most of the population was Puerto Rican. And they taught me how to speak Spanish. It was a really nice relationship. And when I was a student nurse, one of the kids on pediatrics, I still remember his name, Juan Portolantin. I took care of him. We got very close. But my question is, on this island, the one starting with V, I can't remember, that's my age. What is the mood of the people? It seems so depressing.
We are depressed and we're angry. And you've got a lot of people. Unfortunately, Puerto Rico is a very conservative nation, and Vieques is a very conservative municipality. That's like a city or a county or a community or whatever. So you have a lot of people who believe in the United States, who think if we ask nicely enough times that they will get us a hospital. But yeah, it's devastating. A lot of people are
sorry. So sorry.
Can I raise something from a historical point of view? Some of the biggest demonstrations in response to the Vieques situation were really, I mean, on the main island and also were really gathering some steam. But what happened was 9/11. Just like with the Palestinian struggle was really getting to a new stage, a lot of world attention was being given to Vieques, and 9/11 came, and that just diverted that attention and took the air out of the movement. But literally tens of thousands of people almost on a daily basis on the main island, and obviously they really, it looked like there was going to be some movement, but then
I would assume also COVID sort of put the jinx on a lot of things in the last couple of years, and then with the hurricane and all the other terrible tragedies.
can I
Piling
mention
up.
something about Hurricane Maria real quick? On the island, what we now call gentrification in cities like Detroit, you're having that on the island. A lot of rich white people are going and taking properties, buying stuff out, and there's a whole process very similar to gentrification on the island.
Yeah, I noticed in the chat that Karen mentioned that you could replace the name of Puerto Rico with Detroit, and it's the same narrative. Yeah, we'll get gentrified here too. Okay, Tobin, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, I'd like to thank everybody. Gene, I had a question. There was, I think, the Guardian. It may have been some other publication ran a story about how basically the public infrastructure of Puerto Rico is in the hands of hedge fund managers. But that was some years ago, several years ago, and there's like complete blackout until the hurricane. There's very little attention given to it here in the mainland. My feeling is, and this is kind of a sort of a question or just maybe a feeder, that you'd really have to dig for any information right there or go looking for it. Find out what's happening on Puerto Rico. Am I correct?
Yes, you are correct. And that's part of the strategy of the psychological operation of not allowing information to get out. So you have the media blackout that's occurring. So people, in the same way that there was a media blackout for Standing Rock and people had to take the initiative and look for things, it's the same with Puerto Rico. So for example, one of the things that I advocate for when I do give talks and classes is for people to do that. So you have the National Network on Cuba. You've got all of these solidarity groups with Cuba. You've got solidarity groups with Venezuela. You've got people who are focused on particular countries, and that's what they do. They dig. And we need the same thing for Puerto Rico, because that's one of the ways that our colleagues, our comrades, our relatives in the States can help us, because we're screaming at the top of our lungs over here. And our diaspora is screaming at the top of their lungs over there, but people don't listen.
Oh. Yes.
Generally speaking, not saying that about anyone in this room.
No, I guess you can address the mainstream news media also as being owned by the West and pretty much deciding what we should know about and what we should care about. And I know you've done studies on the PSYOP wars through the media, and I'm hoping someday we can have your presentation and the studies that you've done in that area too. That would be great. Anyone else want to say anything? Go ahead, Ozzie.
Yeah, another thing, going back to the comment Frank and Karen said about the connection to Detroit, the person that oversaw the emergency management takeover of Detroit, actually after, I forget his name, I see his face, his next stop was Puerto Rico. He went directly to the island right after they cut the deal, the grand bargain.
Wow. I've also seen some reports and a couple movies, actually, documentaries about how the Clintons had capitalized on human, whatever it is, supporting after the hurricane and trying to human, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, I can't think of it. What do you feel about the work of outside countries coming in to help people after disasters like that? Are they really there to help, or are they there to take over the property and islands?
think it really depends on the group that comes. We've had a lot of instances of people coming in here for nefarious purposes for themselves, for the photo op, to try before you buy your second or third vacation house. Part of the disaster capitalism trend in Puerto Rico has been through a lot of these groups who come in saying that they're here to help when really they're here to capitalize on our crisis. And so that has led to something that Ozzie mentioned, which is the recolonization through gentrification. Gentrification is just colonization under a different name. So that's what's happening. And there are people who come here who are legitimately here to be in literal solidarity with us and are here for the right reasons, and they're welcome. But others are not.
Can you
So-
mention your name, your group, once again, that you had on your logo there?
Sure. It's solely the Puerto Rican Network for the Struggle for Peace and International Solidarity. So the group is newly formed, and we'll be announcing our presence on July 25th, the anniversary of the invasion of Puerto Rico at Guanica, and by the United States.
Wow. All right, and as I mentioned to everybody at the beginning, Monisha is part of the board of the U.S. Peace Council, and we're very grateful that she was able to share her time with us for this event. I know she said she has to leave probably in a minute or two. So once again, we're going to say that there's much more to come from Monisha. I can tell we have a lot more to learn about Puerto Rico, and Ozzie has this all in his life and his body. He's grown up with this, and luckily he's in the town here, and we can see him whenever, occasionally when we get a chance to see him. And I was very impressed with both of your participations on this around this subject matter. This is one of many countries that this is happening in, and this is very close to us because we have a lot of Puerto Rican friends. Karen's got her hand up. Let's hear from Karen.
Yes, I asked a question in the chat. Is it possible that Monisha can answer it?
Yeah, I have heard that independent doctors and electrical workers and artists have helped organize in Puerto Rico from the grassroots, including solar power. What effect has this had in empowering Puerto Ricans?
So in many ways, the assistance that we've received from folks has been helpful. If it's been a temporary intervention, it has gotten us, it's been like a bridge to get us to the next point. Now we have our own strength and resilience. We have our own food sovereignty movement. We do need our doctors to come back home. So where it's helpful for a time, for a season, to have the solidarity from others. Sometimes that can also be destabilizing. And so to me, I think of Che when he talks about the revolutionary ethic, and when he talks about sending technicians and engineers and people for a time with a specific limited purpose and then go. So the unfortunate thing that has happened alongside the very well-intentioned people who've come is that they've perpetuated colonialism by staying, when what we need is support of what we are already doing for ourselves and are capable of doing for ourselves, minus paternalism and minus the white saviorism and all of these things that occur. So I'll come back to it. Really depends on who the person is and who the group is that's coming in, where they are with their own development and awareness and intentions, on whether or not it's helpful for us.
All right, so we're going to close out this section of the meeting. Anyone has any last comments or anything you want to say? Are we all set? Okay, well, thank once again to Ozzie. And Ozzie, hope you can stay for our meeting, our board meeting. And Monisha, thank you for coming all the way from Puerto Rico to be part of us. And we all met you, and we're all your allies.
Thank you so much for having me. It really meant a lot. It really does. Love to everybody, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Keep up the good work.
Bye.
Aye.
And that ends our recording. So the ending will be stop recording.